Our presentation today is talking about some sort of recent changes that have happened not only in the way Alberta OHS is interpreting some of the legislation, but more importantly, how they're enforcing it. And it all relates to a bulletin that was issued finally in December of 2024. So we're going to get into some of those details, some strategies, and so on. We'll get into that as we get going. Realized that I went muted there. I do recognize a number of the names that are on the attendees list, so thanks for those that are coming. A lot of you may be fully aware of what Pinchin is all about, but you might be aware of maybe only some of what Pinchin is about. We do have a large number of services, whether it be occupational health and safety and environmental health and safety, like my group, or hazardous building materials, or environmental due diligence, or all of those various items. You may also not be aware that we are now a North American organization with offices predominantly in the American Northeast, but also in other parts of the country. And we're very much expanding our operations, particularly our engineering operations over the next little while, and looking forward to offering even more services to our clients as time goes on. So you might be familiar with one part of what we do, but here's an opportunity to look at some of the other things that we are about. I'm Chris Taylor. I'm the National Practice Leader for the Occupational and Environmental Health and Safety Group. I happen to be based in Edmonton, but my responsibility is for all of our operations in occupational and environmental health and safety. I've been with Pinchin for about 21 years or so. Been working as a hygienist for, as of February 15th, 32 years. So hopefully provide some historical context to some of the things that we're going to be talking about as we get into this bulletin. So let's kind of talk a little bit about what we're going to do today. We'll give you a little background on the bulletin, but just very great basics. And we're going to get into a little bit of what the history on credentials in Alberta has been, and I'll be able to bring some historical context, both from my experience, but also from other experience as well. We'll delve into what the bulletin says and what it implies. We'll get into some potential issues that I think some of you have run into, and certainly we've identified with how the bulletin is being enforced. And then we'll get into some strategies on what you might want to do to achieve compliance and keep OHS on your good side. We will have a Q&A section at the end of the presentation, but please, if you have questions at any point, I'd say please go ahead and place them into the meeting chat. We'll monitor the meeting chat as we're going along, and be happy to deal with any questions at any point. But we'll definitely have a section and opportunity for those to ask questions at the end of the session. So let's kind of get into this. In 2024, there was a bulletin issued in the middle of the year, and then an updated version that was released at the end of the year in December. And this bulletin was, tips and tricks on how to hire an occupational hygiene consultant, and how, to get a good occupational hygiene report. And it's important to understand that this wasn't new. This bulletin in various forms had been around for a number of years, going back to 2012. And in fact, as I was digging the other day, there probably was even a version before that. But the real difference that we started noticing, and we started noticing this relatively early on in 2025, was not so much what the bulletin said, because what it said wasn't that much different than what had been said before, but what was different was how they were enforcing it. So as opposed to being used as a guideline, which is hey, this would be a good thing for you to use if you're looking for a way to get good quality reports, now it was being enforced. And of particular note, it was being enforced in the asbestos industries and the hazardous building material assessments aspect, which is certainly very different than what had come before it. In fact, the enforcement process went absolutely in opposition to well over 40 years of precedent within Alberta OHS. And so we started noticing that, our clients started noticing it, and we felt that we would take what we've learned over the last year and bring it forward to you as part of our discussion. And so, well, why would they do this, and sort of what's the history on credentials in legislation in Alberta? To kind of give you some historical context, I've been working as a hygienist for over 30 years. I'm a second generation hygienist. My uncle was director of occupational hygiene for the province and was involved in much of the development of the original OHS legislation in the 70s and 80s. So I have background on what a lot of the aspects were when building the legislation, particularly around credentials. And there was a clear and defined absence of credentials in any OHS legislation, in any of the original iterations, and in fact, even up to the current versions. There just aren't specific legislations like we might find in other provinces. So BC, for instance, the credentials that are typically listed in the Bulletin are actually placed in legislation in British Columbia, and we see that in other jurisdictions as well. Now, there have been some attempts. I'm a member of an organization called the American Industrial Hygiene Association. They had an attempt in the 80s to try and establish a professional designation. To give you an example, a barber or a forester has more protection of their title than an occupational hygienist in Alberta. There was another attempt in the 1990s. Both of those failed. Partly due to disagreements amongst hygienists, and also partly just sort of no impetus as people started working on it. There just didn't seem to be the political will. Additionally, and for those of us in the profession, we sometimes find this a little frustrating, our two primary organizations, the Canadian Registration Board of Occupational Hygiene and the Canadian Registered Safety Professionals, the Board of Canadian Registered Safety Professionals, they have sort of indicated that their job is not to lobby for professional accreditations within legislation, that they are accreditation bodies, and that it's not their role to involve themselves in that aspect of things. And so that's something that has led to a real gap. Professional engineers, professional of all types have had more success. You can see a little bit of a list on the right-hand side there of a variety of professions. The pages go on for 3 or 4 pages if you look up that document on the government website. But those in the health and safety profession are not regulated beyond their own professional organizations. Now, there is an organization, the Alberta Society of Health and Safety Professionals, that has, identified this issue and has been trying to get some form of accreditation into legislation. They've been doing it now for well over 7 or 8 years. They have not achieved success. They decided, or based on their discussions, they felt that simply adopting the existing designations, whether it be CIH, ROH, CRSP, CIS, and so on, CSP, pardon me, and so on, that was not something that was going to be accepted. And so they came up with their own designations that would allow for a variety of different folks to either get those designations. On the plus side, it then allowed for people that didn't have certain specific credentials to achieve some of their new designations based on experience and other aspects. But they've been attempting this for quite a long time. At the last presentation that they gave to the AIHA, they indicated that this was being put off to this legislative year, and so it was going to be at least 2 years out. I would also highlight that the Bulletin doesn't reference these attempts, doesn't even talk about it at all. And when you include the enforcement aspects that are happening with Alberta OHS and the Bulletin, it kind of takes the efforts of this association out of the equation. And it's a little disappointing. for those of us who've been around to see that we could do things one way or we could do them another, and now we're sort of doing it a third, and so that'll lend itself to some of the issues that I'll talk about as we go forward. Now, as part of this sort of history, I want to talk a little bit about the idea of how our legislation is kind of derived. OHS legislation in Canada is a mixture of what we call performance-based legislation and specification-based legislation. Performance-based legislation is that don't kill the worker, protect the worker. We're not going to tell you how, we're not going to give you specifics, but we will give you a performance aspect that you have to meet. Specification legislation, on the other hand, it gives you a very specific. So, the reference you can see there, please use CSA standard Z94.402 for anything related to respiratory protection. And it defines itself in a very, sort of black and white kind of way. Now, often industry likes specification legislation because it allows it to, not have to interpret things. But historically, the purpose of performance-based legislation was to allow for industry to come up with their own ways of doing things. And a really good example would be in the oil and gas industry, the use of the H2S Alive training course. That course is not a legislated course. You will not find reference to it in any health and safety legislation. It has become the industry best practice. And so it allows for industry to find those best practices and find creative ways of meeting the legislation. And in this province, historically, allowing industry to find their way has often been very much the desired approach within Alberta Health and Safety. So pros and cons of each of those, and I can tell you, having grown up under my uncle telling me all about the history of legislation, that was a conscious effort, that performance-based legislation was very much a conscious effort in the design of the original legislation. If you look at the size of our health and safety legislation over the last 50 years, you'll see that it has grown, and it's grown by adding more and more specification-based items. And basically, the theory behind that was to make it easier for industry to meet certain standards. But it's still very much performance-based. If you look at the Act, it is very heavily designed around performance-based legislation. And that's going to be important as we go forward. So let's now kind of take a look at what does the law actually say. Now I'm going to start in Part 4, because Part 4 of the Alberta OHS code relates to anything related to chemical hazards. And so a lot of the first kicks on this were things like asbestos and those sorts of things. And so we dive into Part 4. Within Part 4, there's really only a singular reference and to competence and aspects, and that's related to air monitoring. It doesn't get into other components at all. But it then refers back to the Act, and this is where we get into what I feel is the most key component of the performance aspect within the legislation, and that's this term competent. And it defines competent: adequately qualified, suitably trained, and sufficient experience to be able to do a particular activity with a minimal degree of supervision. Do you know how to do it, and do you know how to do it right without supervision? No mention of credentials. The term qualified is not defined in the legislation. And in fact, prior to the change in enforcement policy over the last couple of years, the defense was, could you prove that you did it correctly? If 10 people who were also considered competent looked at what you did, and at least 8 out of 10 of them agreed that what you did was correct, you were considered competent, independent of what your credentials might be. Now, the Bulletin then goes on to define a number of other areas that kind of drive competence and drive anything related to any activity under health and safety legislation. And in general, anyone doing anything has to either be competent or supervised by somebody that is. And so it provides sort of a pathway to a variety of different components within the legislation that drives that. But to me, sort of one of the key aspects is how they then took this information and added a little bit of a tweak. And it's that little bit of a tweak that sort of changes the way things are looked at and certainly changed the enforcement. And it was this idea that they would predefine what they considered acceptable competence, so acceptable qualifications. And it was no longer seemingly based on experience, but it was based on credentials. And sort of that's interesting, and we'll get into the pros and cons of that in a minute. But very much the enforcement aspect was, we're not even going to look at whether or not you did it right or not. We are simply going to look at your credentials. And if you didn't have the credentials as we deem them to be competent, we are not going to accept your work. And that very much flies in the face of the legislation, and is an interesting sort of approach based very differently on the previous policies within enforcement within the branch. Now, there's nothing saying they can't do that. They're certainly within their rights to decide how they want to enforce things, but it does lend itself to some issues. So let's kind of take a look at these credentials and see what we're talking about. And this is where we're going to start finding what we feel are some issues. The Bulletin has a couple of layers of credentials, and this is sort of the first one. And they divide it up into work related to things you can do, things you can sign off on your own, and things you can sign off on other people. So they've dealt with that aspect of competence where you're supervised by somebody else. So they said, well, you can be competent to do it yourself, but you cannot be competent to review other people's work unless you meet certain credentials. And so they list a number, the common ones like the certified industrial hygienist, which is the American designation, the registered occupational hygienist, which is the Canadian designation. They have the ROHT and a variety of things. The ones that we found interesting were things like the professional physicist, professional chemist, engineer, and so on. And some of the components. So, for instance, if you look at a professional chemist, they can sign off not only on their own hazardous building material reports, but they can also sign off on others. Now, I'm quite confident that to be a professional chemist, you don't take anything related to how buildings go together. You might have some background in the toxicology of asbestos and the chemical properties of asbestos, but whether or not you have any understanding of how a building goes together would very much be open to interpretation. And so this sort of starts down the road. One of the interesting ones that we had here as well is the certified hazardous materials manager. And they're equating that level of experience, both to sign off on their own work, but also on the work of others, with credentials like the CIH and ROH. And that's really not, in our experience, the level of training that goes into achieving that credential. That one really does look at buildings and how buildings go together, but it really doesn't delve into the exposure aspects and some of the other components related to those materials that we look at in hazardous building material reports. And therefore they're equating these things together. And so we find that is a very interesting process. I would note at this point that none of this was sent out for comment to the professional bodies or the professional organizations that are represented here. So whether it be the CRBOH, the American Industrial Hygiene Association, the BCRSP, none of those organizations had any opportunity to provide comment on this bulletin or the implied enforcement that was going to happen regarding this bulletin. And I find that also a little interesting and not typical for a lot of things related to legislation within the province. The bulletin then provides sort of the second half, and you can see that there's a variety of other aspects. If you have a university degree along with some other experience, you can do a few things. The one item I wanted to highlight, though, was the item highlighted in red. They do make quite clearly that independent of the credential, that you must only work in your area of competency. And that's something that organizations such as PEGA and other professional organizations, we all have ethical requirements to only work in our area of competence. And that theoretically is a layer of protection for the public. However, in practical experience, we find that that is not always the case. And so, how, if you are a member of the public, if you are not a experienced person, if you are not a credentialed individual, you are almost certainly going to take someone's credentials at face value. And it really sort of, as we look at how and why credentials might be important and why they might be useful for protecting the public, that's something that we really want to delve into. And so we really want to start sort of asking ourselves, why not just put this into law? If credentials are important, if this is now going to be the enforcement policy of the government, why not use the most recent updates to add these credentials and add this aspect into law? It certainly is easier to do so. One of the reasons why the credential aspects failed in the 1980s, that was prior to the issuance of the OHS code. The act and the regulation require an act of legislature, and therefore they must go through the political process, whereas the OHS code can simply be updated by the various ministries. And so there is definitely an opportunity for them to add this into legislation. So certainly don't have a good reason. We've asked that question, haven't gotten a good answer. And in fact, when asked about it, one of the directors focused primarily on this idea of getting good work. That what they were seeing at the ministry was a lot of inadequate or incompetent, I prefer the term uncompetent work. But from our perspective, the law already allowed OHS to put that aside in the absence of credentials. And so whether you're credentialed or not, if you're doing incompetent work, OHS still has the authority to not accept that work as acceptable under legislation. Now, one of the other things I wanted to talk about is this idea of how it started affecting other things that maybe a lot of people didn't think of as occupational hygiene. Organizations such as Pinchin and many others often split out their hazardous building materials groups into separate groups, and they're often done by a combination of those with background in occupational hygiene and those that have more practical on-the-job experience. If you look at this definition of occupational hygiene, though, it's a pretty broad category of things that it implies. Not only does this include things like hazardous building material reports, asbestos surveys, asbestos remediation, mold remediation, it also includes things like indoor air quality and other aspects of anything that might affect a worker either from the workplace or arising out of a workplace into another aspect. And when you combine that with the act, where the employer is responsible for not only protecting their employees, but those that are working at their site, as well as those that might be impacted by the work of their site, this starts broadening out things quite significantly. And it was this broadening out that we started seeing enforcement on in a very broad fashion. And I'll give you an example. A couple of weeks ago, I was up in Peace River teaching the Alberta Government certification course in asbestos. These are building maintenance folks that maintain schools in the Peace River region. They had been visited by OHS and had been told that the simple act of collecting a single asbestos potential sample, so a simple sample of a building material, sending it off to a laboratory for analysis, even if that laboratory was accredited, was not acceptable because the person collecting that sample didn't have a credential and therefore, in the opinion of that officer, was not qualified to collect that sample. And so when we broaden this out, this is what we start seeing in terms of our impacts. And I apologize, I see a spelling mistake in bullet number 3. It should be particular, not particulate. It really started impacting very simple things. We're not the only organization that is seeing this. We're not the only organization that this impacts. But if you're in the building management or building operations side of things, just a simple collection of a sample now, unless you have a credential, if you take their enforcement policy at face value, you are no longer qualified to do. And so that means that the cost implications are significant. If you're now hiring a firm like ours to come out and do some of those things, industry is a good example. In a turnaround, for instance, at an oil and gas plant, you will often have teams opening up boilers and other components, and they'll then have an opportunity to capture a sample of something that would not have been possible prior to that turnaround. They can then grab that sample, send it off, get the analysis, and away we go. If they now have to engage a consultant or some other professional to do this work for them, that is going to be a significant impact on operations and how things function on a day-to-day basis. So we are really finding that while the more traditional occupational hygiene, chemical exposures, noise, radiation, and so on, don't have an enormous impact on a lot of the firms doing this work, that it really does have an impact on the hazardous building materials world, the indoor air quality world, and so on. And so that's where I'm now going to sort of open it up. And this is your opportunity to use the react function if you want. I don't care which one you use. But if you look at these 3 questions, if you have had an impact related to any one of these items, go ahead and select one of the react functions, either the thumbs up or the surprise or one of those. I believe those are active for all of you. If not, this will go slowly. But I suspect that there are a large number of you that have had one or many of these items kick into you. And as I say, I recognize some of the names on the list, but I find that the enforcement aspect has been quite significant. We're also finding that there are regions of the province that are getting a more diligent approach to this than others, but we are finding it almost everywhere. One of our first things was right away in January of 2025, during work out at the Jasper wildfire remediation aspect of things. Our teams out there were being visited on a regular basis related to work associated with hazardous building materials in the damaged buildings. So we started seeing this very, very quickly. And I think these impacts are potentially quite significant. So when we look at some of the impacts, and we look at sort of some of our concerns, one of the first things that we had as a concern was this variation on credentials and the fact that they didn't take the opportunity to get comment from the various credential bodies. And that to me felt, disappointing would be the polite way of putting it, that if there had been an opportunity for them to reach out to those organizations, some of the things that I identified earlier would have been looked at and might have had an opportunity to be modified. Certainly since the bulletin, those concerns have been expressed, but we certainly haven't seen any change either to the bulletin contents or how the enforcement is going. That additional aspect is trying to get a feel for just exactly how this is being rolled out. When there are campaigns of enforcement, usually the campaign is promoted through the department in public offerings. So, 20 years ago, for instance, there was a big push on paint booths, and over the last several years, there's been big pushes on workers who work on roof projects and shingles and so on related to fall protection. Usually, those are publicized out there so that the public can see that there is a campaign going on, but also industry can see and be prepared for that campaign to occur. And that outside of the publication of this bulletin, the change in enforcement policy was certainly not put forward. The other issue that we run into is just availability of these credentialed folks. Pulled some statistics prior to this event. We've got about 450 CIH and ROH holders in all of Canada. Now, when I delve into those statistics, Alberta does have a much higher share than you would think. We're not just 10% of that. We're certainly much higher than that. Alberta and Ontario sort of represent the largest concentration, with BC coming in third. The downside, though, is that how many of those credentialed individuals are either A, working in government or non-governmental organizations, or B, are working directly for their organizations. So, a company like Suncor or so on, they'll have their own industrial hygienists on staff. That means that the number of credentialed individuals available to the public to access to provide these services, it becomes a much, much more limited number. Now, even if we include some of the other credentials, you'll notice about 5,000 CRSP holders in all of Canada, and again, a large percentage here in Alberta. Again, the same thing applies. Those folks are predominantly working for their home companies and are not available out for public and other industry to utilize. So when we look at this idea of available folks, we start looking at how does this sort of jive and connect with some of the other policies that are within the provincial government. The Alberta government, I'm sure all of you are aware, has a Ministry of Red Tape Reduction, and its job is to remove and reduce the amount of regulatory barriers between industry and the public and the regulatory process. And certainly we've seen that along with my duties at Pinchin. I also sit on the Alberta Fire Subcouncil, which manages the fire code here in Alberta. And it's the kind of thing where we have absolutely seen in other ministries a very significant push on reducing legislation. Now, we need to balance that with protecting the public. No question, the goal of occupational health and safety is to protect workers and protect those people that might be impacted by the work of those workers. But in our view, the method of enforcement has added essentially a regulatory barrier to industry. And by doing so, definitely has increased the barrier to meeting regulatory requirements. Now, it absolutely has increased the quality of product, no question. By looking at credentialed individuals only, the quality of the product will certainly increase, and that's a good thing. But in the absence of consultation, I wonder how well this is going to do, and whether or not that was the intent. If the intent was to increase quality, simply increasing the enforcement on poor quality without any change in historical enforcement would have been sufficient. But this is something that we have not gotten an answer from Alberta OHS on how to deal with that. So in many ways, we're asking questions. but it's now out there. It's now being enforced. So now what do you do? Well, obviously, the simplest thing would be just to utilize credentialed individuals. That's really the simplest thing. I often will tell people if I'm doing other training courses that keeping on the good side of your local officer is always a good thing, and so meeting the credentialed requirements is the simplest. But if you or yourself or have utilized people that you feel quite strongly have a sufficient level of experience, sufficient level of training and competence, and that this now excludes that person, then obviously an option is to challenge. And so, organizations across Alberta are challenging some of the interpretations by Alberta OH, while at the same time meeting the enforcement requirements to say, hey, how are we abandoning the actual defined text in the code and in the act and applying a guideline which is not in law? So please speak to that. And why are people who may not have credentials not being evaluated on the quality of their work and therefore the quality of their competence, as opposed to whether or not they have credentials or not? Obviously, the downside of that is that you put yourself in the crosshairs of enforcement, and these things take a long time to process. And so, how then are you going to sort of do that? Well, obviously, I have to start by saying we are a consulting firm. We are selling these services. And so the easiest way for me to respond on a strategy would be to say, simply hire us. We are the largest occupational hygiene firm in Canada. We have more credentialed individuals at Pinchin than anywhere else in the country. And so we are uniquely positioned to be able to do that. But that may not be a strategy that works in all circumstances. So finding folks out there that are going to be able to do this work for you, especially if you are not in a city or a location that has easily available credentialed individuals, how are you going to go about sort of doing that? And so looking to find people that maybe are competent in the collection of data but need that third party oversight. So and maybe you're not hiring a firm like ours to come out and collect the samples, but maybe you're hiring us to interpret the information by somebody that has a lesser credential. And so we're finding situations where organizations that have historically done this work are now continuing to do this work, but using our services as oversight to meet the provincial requirements. If you are somebody that hires somebody to do this work, then it becomes very important that you add that aspect in your contract, that you make it very clear that when you're hiring somebody, that they will meet this bulletin requirement. I often will talk to some of our clients about hiring contractors for other work and making sure that they're diligent in assigning prime contractor status or ensuring that they have adequate safety experience and training. But now here's a new one. And that new one is if you're going to hire somebody to do any of the activities that are considered occupational hygiene under the code, that all of the work that they're doing, they're going to commit to meeting the bulletin. So that if you then run afoul of Alberta OHS, you have that contractual aspect to go back to say, hey, you said you were going to meet this and you don't, and OHS hasn't accepted your work. You now need to pay to have this work done by an individual that Alberta OHS will consider competent. Now, the bulletin itself does outline a variety of ways to do it. I actually find that this site at CCOHS, so if you type in CCOHS hiring a safety consultant, this is just the sort of the first page. It goes on in quite a good detail. I like the section on, what insurance, what questions should you ask them, and it goes into a lot of really good detail on the kinds of things that are worth asking if you're hiring somebody. And I think this is useful whether we're talking about this particular bulletin aspects or anything that you do if you're hiring a third party consultant. I would even offer that whether they're a health and safety consultant or not, that these questions are good questions to ask any one that you're hiring related to, hey, what makes you qualified to do this? What makes you competent to do this? Show me your credentials and protect me. If you're hiring somebody, it's because you don't have the knowledge to do that work yourself in most instances. You're depending upon that third party to do that work for you properly. Adding that layer of hey, what makes you competent to do this becomes very, very important. So if we're kind of summarizing, what all this means and what some of the strategies might be, the bulletin is not law. It's a guideline. But the absolute experience that we're having is that Alberta OHS is absolutely enforcing it. They're enforcing it to a level that we find troubling and very exclusive, but that seems to be the approach. And so if that's the approach, then you need to be prepared in how you're going to deal with that. The simplest thing is, of course, utilizing those folks that are credentialed. And in fact, that may mean, depending on the size of your organization, hiring your own credentialed individual to work within your organization. But if you're going to hire, then making sure that the people you are hiring commit to meeting the requirements of the bulletin is absolutely important. I would add that no other jurisdiction outside of BC has this requirement or has this impact. And so it is very much an Alberta-based item. I would also add that even in BC, there are allowances for competency if the work meets a certain standard. And so when it comes to the enforcement use of these credentials, Alberta very much stands alone. And that is something that, again, I find both interesting and troubling. And I am a credentialed individual. We have a couple of other of our senior staff on the call today. Chris Anderson, who is our director for the region, and Chase Linson, who is our operations manager for our region. They're both CIHs. And so, as I say, we are positioned to be able to support you should you need help in these areas. But I do find it interesting. The logic part of my brain finds this very interesting and potentially troubling in the way it's being enforced, particularly because of the lack of consultation with the industry, with the organizations that they're referencing, and with the public. And so we don't see this going away. We see this becoming a greater issue rather than a lesser issue. And therefore, being able to meet these requirements is something that you're likely going to have to look at as you go forward.